sixth session of the Australian Population Webinar Series. My name is James O'Donnell. I'm in the School of Demography at the ANU in Canberra. I want to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we come together today. I'm currently standing on the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. And of course, we have people joining us from Torres Strait Islander, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander lands from all across Australia, and I acknowledge also that fact and encourage all of us to take a moment to acknowledge and celebrate Australia's first people and their ongoing connection to country. Thank you again for joining us. This is a very exciting session that we have. We had the first of two flash sessions. This is a sort of innovative format that we've created for this session. A huge thanks to Professor Edith Gray and Anna Raimundos for designing and putting on these sessions. This is the first one today. We have our next one tomorrow morning. And so go on to the Eventbrite site and register for that one if you haven't already. Today we have, how many do we have? We have 6 presenters. These are all, we've sort of handpicked all these researchers because we know they've got great research. And so they're going to give us 5 minutes to showcase their research, to talk about what they're doing. And then we're going to open it up to a Q&A session, free for all, in which we're all going to have an opportunity to ask some more in-depth questions. It's a fun format. It's exciting. It's innovative. It's interesting. So it's please take it in that spirit. It's casual. It's an opportunity for us to, just have a good conversation about some really great research that's coming out. And so to our speakers, as I say, we have 6 speakers. Melinda Dodd from Flinders University will be speaking about towards the global goals and examining the nexus of climate change, migration, and the sustainable development goals in the South Pacific. Isabel Cherkesley from Monash University, whose research is on Irish female convicts in 19th century Van Diemen's Land. Xiao Shi from University of Adelaide, who's talking on the entrepreneurial development of Chinese business migrants in Australia. Carolina Mayen-Herta from the University of Melbourne, talking about access to urban green spaces in Mexico City and its effect on well-being. Nairi Pisanu from the University of Tasmania, speaking on resilience in Indigenous Australian families. And Qing Guan from the ANU, speaking on spatial integration of China-born immigrants in Australia. So without further ado, I'm going to throw it over to our first speaker, Melinda Dodd. Thank you very much, Melinda.
Thank you, James. I think James is going to put up a slide briefly so that you have something to look at in addition to me.
Does that come through okay?
There we go. Okay. So since I only have about 5 minutes, I thought I would just give you one slide to take a look at, and then I'm going to walk through a few, just kind of an overview of what I'm doing, and then a bit of the case study approach that I took. So as James mentioned, the title of my thesis is Toward the Global Goals, and the research is examining the nexus of climate change, migration, and the Sustainable Development Goals in the South Pacific. So as most of us know, the majority of the South Pacific is made up of small island developing states, and they are highly vulnerable to the impacts and effects of climate change. Significant related issues including rising sea levels, unstable weather patterns, more extreme or frequent weather events, increased water salinity, loss of marine biodiversity, and it goes on. But within the Pacific context, what this means is that this is impacting the ability of local populations to continue residing in currently occupied areas. Now, I think probably some of the more well-known cases within the Pacific are that of Kiribati or Tuvalu, or some of the islands in Papua New Guinea, where whole communities have ended up relocating or are starting to relocate, or they're putting together different plans to do that. But when we look at the Pacific more broadly, within the context of migration, it's actually a well-established part of a lot of Pacific Island economies and social structures historically. Particularly in Polynesia, there's a number of Pacific Island nations that have a heavy reliance on remittances, which is a different type of migration, obviously, than what's happening in Kiribati and Tuvalu. And so what I started to think about was, within this vast area and this huge region, how are these things actually intersecting one another. So when looking into that, there were a number of international reports that highlighted the need for Pacific Island nations to plan for and manage for the effects of climate change, but additionally to look at how they're managing migration longer term, both economically and in terms of supporting their populations. And that is actually where the Sustainable Development Goals started to come in. So as most of us are probably aware, there is a specific goal, 13, around climate action. And one of the sub-goals within that directly addresses the need to promote mechanisms for raising the capacity for effective climate change related planning. The other aspect that I thought was particularly interesting around the SDGs is goal 17, which is partnerships for the goals. So when I started looking into this more fully, I started to think, okay, well, what would it mean if we got together partnerships to address these issues of climate change and migration and how they're happening in the Pacific? What would that even look like? So obviously, the Pacific being as vast as it is, I couldn't look at all of them. So I came up with about half a dozen selection criteria that I thought would be appropriate, went through most of the countries in the Pacific and came up with 2 of them in which I wanted to do a more focused case study. And in that case, it was the Cook Islands and Tonga. So I started to look at them more specifically. Now, both Cook and Tonga are, of course, highly susceptible to the impacts of sea level rise and climate change. Both of the economies are dependent on climate sensitive sectors. So agriculture, fisheries, tourism, that type of thing. And in both of those cases, the intersection of climate change and migration isn't about whole community relocation. It's about something else. So when looking at Cook, just to give a couple examples, the issues they're facing primarily in terms of climate change are around coastal degradation, those types of issues, water salinity, but it is also complicated by the environmental impacts of tourism, which is the main source of their economy. In Tonga, it's something different. Climate change there is manifesting more in terms of more extreme weather events, Cyclone Gita, Cyclone Harold earlier this year, and the impacts that that's having on infrastructure, but also on flooding, on the ability to raise crops, those types of things. In terms of the migration issue for the Cook Islands, a lot of it is around labor. Both Tonga and Cook have a high level of outmigration, and they do rely on remittances significantly. In the case of Tonga, they are consistently one of the top 5 remittance receiving countries when measured by GDP globally, and have been for a number of years. And at some point, it's estimated that approximately 50% of Tongans are actually overseas at any given time. So a similar situation happens in Cook, where a lot of their population is overseas. And so they don't necessarily have the labor or the local support to support the tourism that happens there. And so when they're talking about migration issues, they're actually looking at more people coming in to provide the labor for their main economic sector, for lack of a better way to put it. So the point of all this is that even just looking at these 2 island nations as examples, the intersection of those 3 issues is significantly different. And so my view on this, and where I'm hoping the research leads me a little more concretely, is that as climate change and migration continue to have the significant impact in these areas and in the region as a whole, I would argue that the Sustainable Development Goals actually offer a focus and a mechanism through which regional cooperation can happen and more partnership structures can take place to address and plan for this into the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Melinda. That was fantastic. Okay, we're going to jump straight now to Isabel. Isabel.
Sure. I'll just share my screen. Sorry. Okay. Hi, nice to be with you today. So more than 160,000 convicts were sent to Australia in the 19th century. 73,000 were sent to Van Diemen's Land, otherwise known as Tasmania. All direct voyages from Ireland landed in New South Wales until the end of transportation to this colony in 1840. Henceforth, Irish convicts were sent to Van Diemen's Land. In the span of 13 years, 1840 to 1853, 4,068 Irish female convicts landed in what would become known as Tasmania. My thesis will use data from the Founders and Survivors Project and the Female Convicts Research Center. To advance statistical analysis, I provide a better understanding of the matrimonial destinies of Irish female convicts in Van Diemen's Land. The current presentation is a very brief overview of my PhD thesis. So, my research will examine female Irish convict marriage patterns in 19th century Van Diemen's Land. And as a good guide to the history of Van Diemen's Land, I highly suggest Alison Alexander's The Companion to Tasmanian History. So my research focuses on three main research questions. What are the correlates of post-transportation marriage for Irish-born and convicted women transported to Van Diemen's Land? For women who did marry, what were the levels of homogamy and how do they compare to the Irish diaspora elsewhere? And what are the correlates of post-transportation crime for Irish-born and convicted women transported to Van Diemen's Land? So what we know. Briefly, what does the literature look like? On one side, there's the historical literature on Van Diemen's Land. Most of this literature is based on qualitative analysis, and only limited quantitative analysis is available. The literature emphasizes the exceptionalism of Irish female convicts as being considered as lesser criminals by the colonies. There is also a focus on the evolution of the convict system and the amount of control there was on marriage, as it was seen as a way to exit the convict state. For instance, women had to apply for permissions to marry before they could marry, as long as they were still under sentence. My research will thus fill this gap in the literature by providing more advanced statistical models to study specifically marriage in 19th century Van Diemen's Land. On the other side is a theory. Theory on marriage is mainly influenced by demographic and economic notions, such as that of the marriage market in the case of my thesis. For instance, Becker's treatise on the family, which looks at marriage as part of job search theory. According to this, marriage is the most desirable state and mates have hypothetical values which are optimized on the market. Theory on crime and marriage is mostly influenced by modern criminology, which has shown a circular link between marriage and crime. Those who marry are less likely to have committed crimes, and criminals who marry, especially those who have good marriages, are less likely to become recidivists after marriage and more likely to desist. So the data in use was provided with the help of the Founders and Survivors Project and the Female Convicts Research Center. Both data sets use the same convict IDs to help linkage, and they use convict records available freely at the Tasmanian Archives, which they have linked to other registers such as marriage, death, or birth to create complete life courses. The final data set includes 2,582 Irish female convicts, more than 50% of the whole population of Irish female convicts who did arrive in Van Diemen's Land. So the methods in use are highly inspired by Pushman's research on marriage in Antwerp. As per this paper, I'll use Cox regression models to study the intensity and timing of marriage. This is combined to descriptive statistics, such as the proportion who married and the median time between arrival and marriage to provide a good portrait of marriage. As a way to study mixed marriages, I use the fine and gray model. Both are coded through R. So here's just a few further readings if anybody wants to screenshot this. Just a few readings that could be interesting if you want to read more about Irish female convicts. So, thank you. I'm just gonna stop sharing.
Thank you, Isabel. Okay, Xiao, over to you.
Okay, sure. So it's okay?
Yeah. Perfect.
Okay, sure. Hi, I'm Chao and I'm from the University of Adelaide. So my topic is about the Chinese business migrants in Australia, and I will specifically focus on their entrepreneurial development from a perspective of blue embeddedness. So I will start my topic from this picture. It's Millionaire Migration. So in 2020, China has become the largest source country for the high net worth individuals migration, and Australia is the largest receiving country. Yes, my topic is specifically focused on the business migrants from mainland China to Australia, and all of them are high net worth individuals, millionaire migration, or even billionaire migration, and all of them are come to Australia via the business migration program. So business migrants and the business migration program actually has been increasingly important in recent phenomena in Australia. Just in this year, the quantitation and the places of the business migration program has been doubled from 7,000 to the 150,000, and where the total amount hasn't been changed. Even though that business migrants is important, but the research on this area is very limited, and most of the previous studies and literatures are focused on the host country like Canada, and the south area is from the Taiwan and Hong Kong instead of the mainland China, even though it has become the dominated country in this area. So this study will not only contribute to the theoretical area for the migration developments, but also have the policy implication for the policymakers to release the economic potential of the business migrants. So this study is based on the theory that the business migrants are social actors embedded in the social, political, and economic sphere, both in China and Australia. And their economic performance, their economic potential, their entrepreneurial development are supposed to be the interactive outcome of the environment. So based on the previous theories and the studies, especially the blue embedded theory, the environment will be classified into three levels. Macro level, which mainly includes like the political and economic institutions, both in China and Australia. And in the meso level, it specifically focuses on like the organizations and opportunity structures surrounding the business migrants and see how they facilitate their development. And the individual level, especially for how business migrants utilize their individual resources to develop their business. Each level is corresponding to each question. And for the final question, I will just specifically focus on that, how these factors interactive and see the nexus of these three levels. So this study is based on a qualitative study, and I have conducted field work in Adelaide and Melbourne. The business migrants relevant informants from migration agencies and business associations have been interviewed. The reason that why I focus on these two cities is that Adelaide and Melbourne are two typical cities for business migrants. Yeah, Adelaide is an emerging city for business migrants just in these 6 or 7 years because of relative favorable local policy. And Melbourne is a traditional attractive cities for business migrants. It has the largest amount. So here is a theoretical frame. As I mentioned above, the study will be based on the blue embeddedness theory. And in the macro level, the economic development in China side, the economic development will be incorporated to see that how this development shape the business opportunities of the business migrants. And the recent, like the China's restriction on the Australia products will be also incorporated. And in Australia side, the immigration policies and the regulations and the business environment will be incorporated. And the meta level is embedded in the macro level. The opportunity structures and the relevant organizations will be considered. And in the final level, micro level, individual level, I see that how Chinese business migrants utilize their human capital, social capital, and financial capital to facilitate their business development. Okay, so this research is still, I'm just writing the chapters, and any feedback and comments will be very welcomed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, that was fascinating. Okay, now who's up next? So we've got Carolina up next. over to you.
Okay. I don't know what, I'm not able to share my screen. I don't know why, but my presentation is not showing on the share screen.
But you can still see the presentation up on your computer?
I can see it in my computer, yeah.
It's not coming up as an option to share.
But it's not, yeah, in the options to share, I can't see the presentation. So maybe I'll just share this. Has it come?
It has.
Okay.
Phew.
Perfect. So the title of my thesis is The Use of Urban Green Spaces in Mexico City and Its Effect on Well-Being. My objective is to analyze the factors that contribute to the use of urban green spaces in Mexico City and its effect on well-being. For analyzing well-being, I'm gonna take both components of well-being, the first one being objective well-being, which is tied to physical health, and the second one is subjective well-being, which is tied to emotions, the perception of surroundings, the perception of self, and how satisfied you are with your life. So my 4 research questions, I would start with, who has access to urban green spaces in Mexico City? So the first precondition for being able to use green spaces has to do with the physical presence of the space. For this reason, it was very important for me to analyze if all neighborhoods in Mexico City have access to green spaces regardless of their socioeconomic status. So I want to see if there is equity in green space distribution in the city. The second question is, which quality features encourage green space utilization? And this is important because depending on the quality of the green spaces, people will tend to use them for different purposes or they will affect well-being in a different manner. For example, larger green areas encourage physical activity, or green spaces that are perceived as being safer might have a greater effect or impact on subjective well-being. The third question is, what is the association between the frequency of use of urban green spaces and well-being? And here I included another question, which is, did this association change during the pandemic? Because when I was collecting my data, the pandemic happened. Now I needed also, or it was interesting for me to study the effect between the use of green spaces and well-being during the pandemic, and if maybe the pandemic intensified the effect of maybe if this effect was lesser because of the extraordinary circumstances that we're living presently. And the fourth question is, to what extent does access to and quality of UGS influence patterns of gentrification? It was also important to me to see if green spaces are improved or if new green spaces are introduced, if at the end of the day, they're gonna benefit marginalized populations, or they're gonna benefit the people they were intended to benefit, or they're gonna benefit others. So why was I interested in urban green spaces? As urbanization rates are growing, there is a pressing need to focus on developing policies and maybe strategies to increase the urban quality of life. And urban green spaces can be used as a public health tool that improves air quality, provides recreational opportunities, increases the livability of neighborhood, and enhances the aesthetic value of cities. Moreover, for lower and middle income populations, which often lack private access to green spaces or have access to fewer sources of recreation, green spaces can play a role as equalizers of socioeconomic disparities in health, as they provide opportunities to relax, perform physical activity, and thus increase well-being. During the COVID crisis, green spaces have taken on special importance. This is because the way in which we interact with each other and how we use spaces has changed, overall affecting well-being of the population. For my methods, for my first question, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna do a geospatial analysis and I'm gonna use ArcGIS Pro. For my second question, I selected 16 participants and I invited them to photojournal for 10 days. At the end of this experience, I had in-depth interviews with each one of them. Because of the pandemic and that I couldn't have physical contact with my participants, I had to do all this through WhatsApp. And this experience took place in October 2020. For my third question, I designed an online survey and it was made in Qualtrics. It was advertised through social media, particularly through Facebook. In Mexico, there are 89 million Facebook users, so it is a very good platform for doing this. I had almost 2,000 participants and I performed a multi-level regression analysis with my first level of the analysis being the individual and the second one, the region of the city. I did this through Stata and the data was collected in June 2020. And for the last question, I'm gonna do a case study with Bicentenario Park, which is a park located in a lower middle income neighborhood of the city. And it's gonna be a longitudinal study in which I'm gonna see if the land use and the prices of the properties increase or stay the same. For doing this, I'm gonna use data from the National Household Survey from 2008 to 2018. At the end, what is my end result with this project? The intent of this thesis is to support policy making with scientific evidence, providing tools to evaluate, quantify, and compare the distribution and quality of green spaces in the city. I want to provide suggestions for a more equitable city so that everyone can enjoy the benefits from these spaces. And with that, I finish my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that more fascinating research. Okay, we will jump straight to Nairi then.
Thanks, James. So before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land here in Tasmania, the Palawa people, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Hi everyone, my name is Nairi. I am a PhD candidate in the School of Social Sciences at the University of Tasmania. So my PhD research is looking at resilience in Indigenous Australian children and the role of individual, family, and community factors. So the data set that I'm using for my PhD research is called the Longitudinal Study of Indigenous Children, or LSIC for short. So LSIC is a national study that has been conducted by the Department of Social Services in Canberra. So LSIC began in 2008, and since then, 13 waves of quantitative data have been collected from over 1,200 Indigenous children and their families. So this data has been collected via face-to-face interviews. So my research is using wave 10 of the data, and the children in this wave are between the ages of 9 and 14. So what is resilience? Resilience is defined as the ability to maintain positive functioning during times of adversity. So I think the best way to understand resilience is to think about your own life. Maybe you can think of a time where you experienced high levels of adversity or stress, but you still managed to cope. Then we can start thinking about some of the reasons why. So what resources are available to help us overcome stressful situations? These resources are called protective factors. So protective factors buffer the negative effects of stress, and they are found in different domains of our lives, including at the individual, family, and community levels. So we know that many Indigenous Australian families function quite differently to non-Indigenous families, and therefore they will provide different kinds of protective factors to their children. In particular, resources at the community level, as shown in the diagram here on the right, may contribute to resilience for Indigenous Australian children. So these unique community level factors can include things like cultural identity, spirituality, and connection to land. So previous research in this space has shown that strong relationships with community members, such as peer mentors or elders, can predict positive outcomes. And these relationships can provide additional support to children in high-risk circumstances. So while this may be true for some Indigenous groups, it is also important to acknowledge that there is significant diversity across urban, regional, and remote Australia. So in my research, I will account for these geographical and cultural differences. So this brings me to just one of my research questions, as I don't have much time today, so I'm just going to talk about one. What individual, family, and community factors contribute to resilience in Australian Indigenous children? So to address my research question, I will classify the children in my sample into 4 groups, depending on their exposure to stress and how well they adapt. So in this context, risk is measured by a cumulative stressful life event scale, and adaptation is measured by the Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire, which looks at social and emotional well-being in Indigenous children. So resilient children are considered to be at a high level of risk, but continue to maintain competent functioning. So that's this 3rd category here. And these are some of the protective factors that I'll be looking at. And I have some examples here from the 3 different domains. So at the individual level, we see things like age, gender, personality traits, and social skills. At the family level, we have things like household composition, parenting, relationships between parents, extended family support, and things like that. And at the community level, we have things like knowledge of culture, community safety, and whether or not the children knows an Indigenous language. So I'll be using multiple logistic regression to explore what protective factors are associated with resilience compared to these other 3 categories. So finally, where am I up to in my PhD? So at the moment, I'm in the final stages of cleaning my data, and next year I will start analysing my data. Thank you.
Terrific, thank you, Nori. And we'll go now to Ching. Over to you, Ching.
Thank you, James, for the introduction. In the presentation, I will give an overview of my PhD research on the spatial integration of China-born immigrants in Australia and non-spatial factors related. Over the last few decades, Australia has seen increasingly more migrants coming from Asia as international students, skilled migrants, and their families. Of them, the China-born population is a substantial and rapidly growing one. The estimated resident population statistics published by ABS show that in 2017, the China-born population became the 2nd largest group with more than 600,000 persons. This is a population defined by place of birth and place of current residence. There are persons born in mainland China who are usual residents of Australia. Tourists are not included, but international students and other types of temporary migrants are. How have these new migrants integrated in Australia? If and how are their patterns of integration differing from earlier arrivals from Europe? These questions are important because successful integration of migrants would benefit the Australian society, both economic-wise and cultural-wise. And it's also important for migrants themselves, as integration usually go hand in hand with upward socioeconomic success. In my thesis, I center on migrants' spatial integration, which concerns where migrants live and how that compares to residential patterns of the native-born population. Spatial integration is largely viewed as an end product of economic and cultural integration, and also reinforces the socioeconomic and cultural integration of migrants through, for instance, intergroup contacts when migrants and non-migrants living in the same places. Where migrants live is also important for regional population and economic growth. There are long-established regional sponsored migration schemes with growing numbers of permanent migration intake. In my thesis, I used data from Australian census and found that, as you can see in the chart here, over the last 4 decades, China-born migrants are showing an increasing level of dissimilarity index before 2001 census when compared to the Australian-born population, and a decreasing index after 2001. The higher the index, the lower the level of spatial integration. So it means that their levels of spatial integration decreased between 1981 and 2001 and increased after the 2001 census. I looked at the index by age and by migrants' length of stay in Australia and found that the overtime trend has to do with the changing composition of China-born migrants, where the new arrivals, including skilled migrants and students, are large in numbers and are more integrated, less concentrated spatially compared to their earlier arrivals from mainland China. I also examined their interstate migration patterns and found new China-born arrivals showing higher migration propensities in 2016 than 2006, and having interstate destinations shifted away from New South Wales, which may have to do with increasing importance of state and regional sponsored migration scheme in channeling temporary migrants, including the graduates, to obtain permanent residencies in other places. In the 2 papers I published from my thesis, I also compared the spatial distribution and interstate migration patterns between migrants born in mainland China and other major overseas countries. As you can see here, for instance, the dissimilarity index for European-born and Indian-born migrants are showing different levels of integration and different trends over time. To test the spatial assimilation and segmented assimilation theories, I examined the association between spatial integration and non-spatial integration for the China-born migrants, and found that high economic, linguistic, and political integration are associated with having more Australian-born neighbors and living in neighborhood with higher socioeconomic index, the CIFA index. This confirms spatial assimilation theory in the Australian context. However, higher education attainment and English proficiency not always predict higher spatial integration. Different birthplace groups also have some relatively different associations on key variables, including income, English proficiency, and citizenship. This evidences pose questions on how integration is to be defined in a country continuously recruiting skilled and highly educated migrants, and challenges the conventional spatial assimilation integration views. Thank you.
Thank you, Ching. Wow, I'm sure you'll all agree that they were 6 fantastic presentations. That was very interesting. So now we're going to go to the Q&A session. So if you have any questions, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen there, the Q&A, and write in your question. You can also say your question live. So if you put your hand up in the participants box, you can put your hand up and we can allow you to talk, and you can ask your question in person. So bring them in, and we do have one question that's come in on the Q&A function. So I'm going to ask that one, and that was a really good one. This one's for Isabel. An anonymous attendee says, very interesting presentation. I'm wondering what information is available from the archives you're using about the characteristics of the female convicts and the husbands for those who marry. For example, their age, if they have children, have they been married before, etc.
Yeah, so there's a lot of information available. We have age, number of children that they brought with them, number of children they had in Ireland. We have if they were married, we have where they were born, convicted, the crime they were convicted for. We also have some more interesting information that I'm not currently using, but we have eye color, hair color, height, behavior, quote unquote. And then afterwards, we'll have marriage and when they married, who they married, and if their husband is a convict, then we'll have the same type of information. So where is he born? What crime was he convicted for? And all the stuff like the age, the eye color. And so there's a lot of information because it's, at that time, the convict system really wanted to track every single thing. So we really are tracking a lot of what's happening with them. We also have some information. So the system was they would be employed. So we have information on where they were employed. So if she's employed in Launceston and then afterwards she's employed in Hobart, we'll have the follow-up to where she was during her sentence. So that's just a brief overview.
Terrific. That sounds like a really rich data set.
Yeah.
Is there anything on sort of cohabitation? Did the women always marry, or would they live in relationships?
So we don't have like purely the information on cohabitation, but you can deduce some stuff. For instance, if a woman asks for permission to marry at some point with a man, and then she has children and only marries like 20 years later, you can deduce that she was probably cohabitating. And then there's some information like that where if you look at the name of the children and when she married the husband, so if she married him later, you can also deduce a lot about that, but no pure information. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Isabel. Melinda, I have one for you. I found that really striking, that comparison between Tonga and Cook Islands in terms of the relative importance of imported and I guess exported labour. Do you also see that diversity across the Pacific in terms of the likely climate change impacts? I mean, sometimes we hear it as if all the islands have it's going to be a big impact, but don't necessarily hear so much about that diversity of impacts and how Pacific Islands themselves might work together and the collaboration between them to solve potentially some problems in the future.
Yeah, one of the really interesting things that I found is exactly that, the diversity of how climate change and those impacts are manifesting in different places. So I mentioned just briefly at the end in terms of Tonga, when I was actually there just starting some of my fieldwork earlier this year when COVID hit, so I couldn't finish it in country, obviously. But some of the things I found there, particularly, like I mentioned, when they talk about climate change and when they think about climate change, they think about cyclones. They think about Gita a few years ago. They think about, Harold that just happened, those types of things. And so for them, climate change means flooding. Climate change means more extreme weather events. Climate change means their churches are blown out, their houses are, things like that. That's what it means to them. Whereas in other places, it very much is about coastal erosion. And so communities that live along the coast need to either find other island groups within their nation to move or move slightly inland, which is a different sort of issue that they're dealing with. So you're absolutely right. Looking from the outside, we tend to go, oh, it's rising sea levels and it's coastal stuff and it's all kind of the same. But it's actually very, very different depending on which island group you're looking at, and even depending on which island within a particular country, since many of them are, of course, made up of multiple islands, and how that manifests. So I think it's part of the challenge in looking at the intersection of these issues in such a vast area as well.
Terrific. And Chow, I really loved your map of the world and the flows of high wealth individuals. Why do you think Australia is such a big recipient? I mean, you touched on opportunity structures. Is it the opportunities good in Australia? Is there something particular about Australia that attracts people? And what sort of places are they coming from?
Yes, and one of my subtopic is like the opportunity structures, how opportunity structures shape the business migrants. So from my personal view, Australia in recent years, the one thing, actually in all over the world, there are just these countries for attracting high net worth individuals: Canada, United States, Australia, and New Zealand, and such European countries. So this is the 4 major countries for attracting the 100 worth individuals. And Canada actually is the top attractive countries in D4. But Australia, especially for Chinese people, is that for one thing, Australia has like the same time zone for China. And the second reason is that the environment. You know, Canada is super cold in most of areas, but Australia has a nice weather. And the third reason is that Canada just cut off their policy, their business migrant policy in 2012. And a lot of them just chose to Australia. And especially in Adelaide, the policy is very friendly. And you can just invest like $600,000, and you may get the permanent residency. And so maybe this is the reasons, yeah.
Great. Okay, keep sending in through your questions, everybody. We've still got about 10 minutes, well, up to 10 minutes. So send through your questions. They're great, obviously great presentations. And I guess just while we wait for more questions to come in, I might direct one towards Carolina. So that COVID, I mean, that must have a dramatic effect on people's use of public spaces as well as their well-being. And I guess the two might be related, but they have separate effects as well.
I think yes, and I think depending on the population group you're referring to, there were some people that had, of course, like much more negative effects. For example, what I've noticed after talking to many of my participants were that people living with older adults won't go outside, even if they can, or even if they have an access to a large urban green space. They are afraid that they might be exposed to COVID and they might get their loved ones sick. So for them, it has been an extra challenge on their mental health and also on their physical health, because sometimes in their homes, they don't have a space to exercise. Also, the most marginalized areas of the city, which often lacks green space access to larger areas, were the ones where the smaller parks are located. Those smaller parks closed because there was no way to enforce that a limited number of people were going to be able to use them, and that everyone was using face coverings and keeping the social distance. So people in the most marginalized areas of the city are the ones that haven't been able to access any sort of park because there are no parks open nearby, and they're really, really struggling.
Thank you. We've also had another question come in for you from the Q&A. It says, I thought your presentation was great. I'm curious if people in your study area tend to live in houses with front or backyards and therefore also have their own green spaces, or do most people not have access to this, such as live in apartments? I know in Canberra during a lockdown, a lot of people with yards spent a lot of time in their gardens to get outside, but while still safely being at home.
I think the case of Mexico City, it's very similar to a lot of Latin American countries, that it's highly segregated. So in lower income neighborhoods, people don't have access to private green spaces, while for people that have the higher resources and where most green spaces are located, they also have access to private green space. So this is at least what has happened in the pandemic, that the people that need it the most are the ones that have the least access, and perhaps the people who have access to private green spaces and don't need to go outside are the ones that have the larger parks closed.
Great, thank you. And Nairi, in using the LSIC, I guess that would be. So I was going to ask you how you're able to operationalize and measure resilience in the survey, and also a little bit of a follow-up. Do you think that some of those individual family and community level factors, they might intersect with each other? And are you able to sort of tease out some of those maybe interactions?
Yeah, so there are a couple of ways to measure resilience in the literature. The first way, which I mentioned in my presentation, is called person-based analysis. So basically what you do is you get a risk, so you have the risk and you also have sort of like a mental health measure, and you have a cutoff for each of those, and you classify those scores. And then, like I mentioned in the presentation, you see which protective factors are associated with being resilient versus the 3 other categories. And then there's also another method, which is called variable focus models. And like you mentioned, James, there's a few different types, but one is an interaction model. So you look for indirect effects. And another type is to look for main effects. So there are a couple of ways to measure resilience. For starters, I'm going to stick with the person-based analysis because that has been done with Indigenous populations before in Australia. So I'm going to start with that, and then I'll probably move to some more complex models and just see how it goes.
Great. And we had a couple more questions coming through on the Q&A function. Patrick Kaur wanted to ask Carolina, I'm aware proximity to green space is used in some analysis in Australia. It is being used as a type of geography classification. Have you looked at using here to incorporate in your analysis?
Yes, so for my first question, which is the question that it's related to access, I'm defining mainly access as physical access, which is proximity. And what I'm doing is that first I'm dividing the city in urban blocks, which is the smallest geographic area in which you can analyze the information in Mexico City. And I'm analyzing if urban blocks have access first at 300 meters to any green space. And I'm doing it with walking distances because this is universal, and perhaps people with disabilities or people that have mobility restrictions, such as children, this is the type, like walking is how they can access a green space. But then I'm amplifying that distance depending on the size of the green space. Because what theory says is that usually when the green space is larger, people are willing to walk more to reach that green space. So I'm doing a catchment area analysis, and it has to do exactly with that, with proximity and sizes.
Excellent. I had a follow-up from Udo Esekia for you as well. He asked, are you including crime rate or experience with crime as a measure of subjective well-being?
What I'm doing in terms of security is that I'm analyzing perceptions, because sometimes crime rates are like objective measures of crime and security or something, but what people perceive dictates more the behaviors. And so far what I've encountered is that there is a heightened perception of insecurity amongst women. And for example, larger green areas, especially during the pandemic, women don't want to go because they feel that if something happens to them, there's no one nearby, but they don't trust the police. So they also don't want to go to areas where the police is present. And for men, it's almost the opposite effect. Larger green spaces allow them to feel less anxious about the COVID and more free that they don't have to use the mask. So it has been almost like a type of separating. This is a factor that separates men and women. How do they perceive green spaces?
Terrific, thank you. Okay, so we've just got a few more minutes if there are any sort of last questions coming in. We haven't heard again from Ching, so I might ask her a question. Ching, there seemed to be a bit of an increase in dissimilarity up to 2001. You talked about some of the new arrivals being a little bit more integrated since 2001. Do you know why that might have increased to 2001?
The index was increasing, which means the level of spatial integration or decreasing before 2001. And the higher the index, the lower the level of spatial integration. So the way I interpret the figure is before 2001, the index increase means the level of integration decrease, and after 2001, with the new arrivals coming who are more spatially integrated than their earlier arrival cohorts, the index decreasing, which means the level of spatial integration improved.
So do you get a sense of why it might have been increasing before 2001?
And increasing before 2001 for the Chinese? Or why is it increasing?
Yeah.
Well, it might have to do with, I haven't really looked into the cohorts because my thesis focus on the post-2000 cohort, more or less. But before 2000, it might have to do with the inflow of the Tiananmen Eastern-related humanitarian migrants who arrived at around the time of 1990, 1990. And later on, there were a group of family migrants relating to those humanitarian migrants. So they might have an increasing level of concentration in terms of where they live.
Do we have good data on the population, spatial population data going back? Because obviously 2006 onwards, we have access to Table Builder. Is there a way we can analyze these things prior to 2006?
Well, we can use census. I used census sample file data. But I'm using the 5% one, which only goes to 2006 again, I think. And for the 1% one, it can go back to the 1980s, but the number of Chinese were relatively small at that time. But yeah, it can be done through the individual level sample file.
Terrific. Thanks, everybody. I don't see any more questions coming through the Q&A. I think we've answered everything, just double checking that I'm not seeing anyone's hand up. Okay, well, we might wrap it up there then. Thank you everyone for attending. Thanks to our participants. That was 6 really fascinating presentations, really different obviously, but also really interesting, and wish you all luck with your studies and finishing up your studies for some of you and continuing on for others. Tomorrow, remember that we've got another flash session. I think it starts at 10:30 Australian Eastern Daylight Time. We then have the Australian Statisticians seminar to close the Australian Population webinar series in the afternoon, Canberra time. So please join us for that. You can register for Eventbrite if you'd like to do that. Thank you very much for participating so far. I think the series has been great, and we couldn't have done it all without the fantastic presenters like we've had today, as well as the team behind the scenes, most particularly led by Edith Gray. So thank you very much, everybody. We'll hopefully see you tomorrow. Have a great week otherwise. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.